it is Juan already. Welcome all of you in this session. We are on the session 2A, Behavioral Insights and Effective Communication for Climate Change Mitigation. We have 6 presentations today, which is a lot for the time we have. In order to be on time, the speakers need to provide us a very compact presentation, and then regarding the questions and answer session, I would suggest dedicate 5 minutes immediately after each speaker finishes, because judging from what I've seen in the morning panels, in the end there wasn't so much time for that. But I would like to suggest that if you have a question, just type it on the chat, and then either you or me can ask the question to the presenter, because then it's also easier to see and reflect upon it. Because after 6 presentations, if we give everything for the last minutes, then we will have already had a lot of info available, and it will be difficult to go back in our memories and do so. So it's presentation and Q&A. And please type any question you have in the chat. So the first presentation is from Daniel Wuebben. Daniel is a Marie Curie fellow, and he's presenting to us a paper, Marie Curie fellow in the Juan Carlos University in Madrid. And he presents to us a paper on public engagement, social media, and the renewable energy transition in Spain. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
I was just saying, I think the most important thing I can do with the 10-minute window is not go over time and stress out my co-presenters, but also to try to give you maybe just like one important thing or to take away. So again, my name is Daniel Wuebben. I'm working at the Universidad de Juan Carlos, also with the Spyridon group, and I'm working on this specific project about social media and public engagement in the energy transition with Juan Romero-Luis, who's a PhD student in the communication department there. So since last October, we began doing semi-structured interviews with different stakeholders from academia, institutions, and government. We found most of these because these individuals were involved in some way with an H2020 project. We conducted semi-structured interviews and recorded those and posted YouTube videos, as well as followed up with a Likert scale survey. The goal is to really understand how they both view energy transitions, but also how they view the communication aspect and how important it is for them to be communicating both in different media and through different channels and in different audiences. So again, these were a little bit different than typical semi-stakeholder interviews or semi-structured interviews, because we recorded those and we posted clips of them to YouTube. And so that, I feel like, as we're finding in our results, can impact in some ways the answers that people gave, and how comfortable they were explaining things. But if you are interested in watching any of these, they're up on the Spyridon page on YouTube. And there's some interesting, and again, we tried to make them short and relevant clips. We've then transcribed these and sometimes translated them, because we did the interviews both in English and in Spanish, depending on how the interviewee felt more comfortable. And we've uploaded these into Atlas TI, and we're using a grounded theory approach in order to kind of read through the transcripts multiple times and understand what kinds of codes and code groups we can apply to really understand what are the most important things about energy transitions and about communication. From this, we've kind of developed 2 hypotheses. One is that individuals in academia and industry feel more comfortable communicating with the public, and the communication outcomes that they see as most important are raising awareness, empowering citizens, and changing behaviors. This empowering citizens, I think, goes hand in hand with the clean energy package and the idea of putting citizens at the center and creating this level playing field. And that's something that we've heard a lot about in the previous sessions, and I think we'll continue to hear a lot about this year, is this focus of putting citizens at the center and empowering citizens. And that relates to a whole separate set of issues of what citizenship means and what power means. But for now, these are the kind of three things that they feel comfortable with. What they feel less comfortable with is how to engage with policymakers or understand and explain policy to the public. And so that's something that we're looking at and how we can improve that over the coming years. In terms of social media, the findings of the Likert scale survey showed that sharing findings, at least with the public, through LinkedIn and Twitter are sometimes the most important kind of channels. You can also see here in the middle that YouTube is also an important channel for disseminating results, again, to the public through social media communication channels. That doesn't mean that, at least in academia, most of us aren't still beholden to the idea of publishing in peer-reviewed journals, but in terms of public engagement, these are the channels that currently stakeholders are seeing as important. One of the other things that came out of both the interviews and in the follow-up surveys was that the use of images, graphics, and memes to communicate is increasingly important. One of the things that we found interesting is even though something like 70 to 80% of people in Spain live in multifamily dwellings, or in other words, like apartment buildings, the most often used graphic for explaining self-consumption using solar panels and its connection to the grid is this idea of a single family home, like right next to a massive electricity pylon. And so how do we visualize our interconnections with the grid, and how do we increase grid literacy is one of the other things that we're thinking about. Again, while we're interested in the expert stakeholders' ideas about the energy transition and what's happening in Spain, we're also really focused on how they think about communicating those ideas and communicating those changes, and seeing that communication can be one of the most important ways that we can change behavior. So I tried to be really fast there. I can't see whether or not there's any questions that are coming in. But if you have any questions or you want to read the draft or hopefully the preprint of this research, I'd be happy to share it with you or connect either via email or Twitter.
Well, Daniel, you are impressively fast.
I'm sorry. Maybe I talked too fast and wasn't able to really
thank you.
allow some time. But again, I think the most important thing you could do, at least that I could do in this situation going first, is not to go over time.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I have a question. I don't know if someone else wants to take the floor as well. Please do so. But my question is, you said that it is difficult to explain policy, or that's what you identified the institutions and the, let's say, policy knowledge holders say it's difficult to explain policy. Do you know why?
I don't know exactly why. I mean, I have some ideas. Oftentimes, like something like the clean energy package or the recent PNIEC or Plan Nacional de Energía y Cambio Climático. I mean, these are 500-page documents, and even sometimes as academics, it's difficult for us to read them and really understand them. And even some policymakers, as we're finding out increasingly when it comes to energy, will sometimes make decisions about policy and then not realize kind of what was in the policy that they approved until much later, until the system starts to break down. And that's something that we saw in Spain between 2008 and 2011 with this huge surge of investments in renewable energy, was because there were some things in the renewable energy policy that in hindsight shouldn't have ever been in. Right. So one is that energy policy is large and complex and takes a lot of time to read and study and understand. And two is I think that we often we often think of engagement, at least with the public, in terms of things like likes or views or hits. Like as long as there's people there, we think we've made an impact. But when it comes to policy, that impact is much harder to trace, right? It takes years for us to understand how maybe a policy or a law gets written or changes. There's not that kind of quick, viewable, calculable impact that we can see that we might with public, with how many people show up or how many people cite us or retweet us or something like that.
That's totally true. And we have another question now. I don't know if you can see the chat. It comes from Ellen Webborn. What is the public or researchers who said they found YouTube, LinkedIn, etc. valuable or important for information sharing? Are they researchers? And is there a way to know whether they are picking the best channels?
Yeah. Well, again, the majority of the people that we interviewed are researchers, but they were involved in an H2020 project, and those inherently involve some kind of communication, with the public or some kind of like public dissemination of results. Is there a way of understanding whether they're picking the best channels? I don't know if there's a best channel, or most impactful channel. I mean, this is really what we're struggling with, I think, right now in this kind of push and this kind of difference between. It'd be similar to asking like, what are the best journals? If you only go by impact factor, then you'll get some, but those might necessarily be the best for you. So I think in terms of communication, I think audience is important. I think media is important, and I think it's important to think about what kind of message you want to send or what kind of goals you want to achieve. For instance, right now, many people think that YouTube is an excellent way, or these kind of online seminars are an excellent way to engage with people, but we're missing a lot of people in that, in these communication efforts. A lot of people, especially the hard to reach energy consumers, are only going to be reached when we are able to go to door, or we're able to, again, hold these public meetings and see people face to face.
Many thanks, Daniel. We have a reaction from Wendell, where he proposes that we can use energy feedback devices to inform people about policy changes in a simple interactive format. I guess Wendell, he will speak about that also in his presentation.
Great. Yeah, I look
Many
forward to
thanks,
hearing more about that.
Daniel. You were very precise. Thank you for that. If you want, I guess it would be also nice to put these links of contact or your Twitter profile on the chat so that we can directly follow you there.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks a lot again. And we move to our next presentation. It's Noam Bergman and Katy Janda. Correct me if I don't pronounce your names well. Noam is a lecturer in energy policy at the University of Sussex, and Katy is a research fellow at the Energy Institute of the University College London. Today with us, I don't know who will be the presenter. I guess Noam.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Noam. Noam will present the work on ecosystems, how an ecosystem of stories can play a role in the transition to a low carbon future. Noam, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. Katy will also maybe chime in. It's just very early for her because she's joining us from the US. So thank you for joining us so early, Katy. So let's dive straight in. Here we go. Okay, so about stories. So stories are one of the oldest forms of human communication. Okay, they play an important cultural role. They help us create shared beliefs, purposes, norms, and so on. And this has been true throughout human history. Now, we also want to talk about narratives. Narratives are something more formal than stories. Okay, a narrative is a constructive story. It's nonfiction. It shows development from problem to resolution. And for example, you can think of future scenarios, projections, model results as narratives. And one thing to say about narratives is that they can be powerful rhetorical tools because they like any story, they present one vision of reality, but always obscure other portions of reality in order to make their point. So one final thing we want to talk about is a dominant narrative. A dominant narrative can be thought of as a story that society tells itself. It is really a paradigm that we are socialized into, some people would say. Carolyn Merchant says, we internalize narratives, ideology, a story told by people in power. So all of that's a bit theoretical, so let's try and relate it to what we're talking about, transition to low carbon energy. The current narrative we live under has been called modern economic growth. This is about technology, progress, and modernity. It begins with the Industrial Revolution, basically. This narrative portrays the only future, at least the only positive future, as basically a high-tech version of the present, where technology is the leader in solving all our problems. This approach tends to minimize more systemic change sometimes, so therefore it can benefit powerful incumbents who can continue their business models. Now this has been Barca in about 10 years ago actually, so argued that this narrative systematically silences environmental and social costs and global inequalities incorporated into current energy regimes. So this is the dominant narrative, marginalizing or silencing other stories or things that don't fit this main story. And it's not a question of is this narrative good or bad. What we want to know is this narrative fit for purpose, given our current challenges, climate change, environmental problems, otherwise social sustainability. What stories and narratives are helpful for us, and is the modern economic growth useful? So one thing is this narrative narrows our options for the future by marginalizing the other stories. So this could leave us unprepared or underprepared to face our current challenges if we only have a limited number of solutions. The response to environmental challenges has been basically green growth, to morph the idea of modern economic growth into green growth. And in this narrative, sustainability is often narrowed to greenhouse gas emissions. That reducing emissions is taken as shorthand for all of sustainability, when in fact we know it's much more complicated than that. COVID recently has also highlighted some problems, deep inequalities globally, and exposed what has been called a fragile efficiency of the system, when what we want perhaps is a more resilient system. Okay, so that's sort of our introduction. And the next chapter of our story, what we want to say is actually we see stories as multiple. We suggest that no one narrative is enough to prepare us for all of the challenges for the future. Our scenarios and projections really need multiple stories from different perspectives and the agency of a variety of actors. And an example to illustrate that is the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They have different focuses. They are operationalized differently in different places, and they support a series of different visions because different SDGs have focus on different aspects of social sustainability or environmental sustainability, and we know that they pull in different directions, and there are even tensions between the different SDGs. So that's sort of where our thinking is. And just to illustrate that, this is some work that Katy did with Marina Tapuzzi a few years ago called A System of Stories. And this is in the context of energy in buildings. So first we have the hero story, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Anyone who's seen a Hollywood film knows what a hero story is. Technology is often the hero in these stories. The new heat pump, the new insulation will solve your energy problem. That is the hero of the story. But there are other stories. We have the horror story. The horror story is that thing, that technology that didn't work, the problems, perhaps even, people were killed in some accidents. If we don't tell those stories, we can't learn from them. Then we have our learning stories. People never used technology as it was envisioned in the lab. So learning from how people really use things, both for users and for people who develop technology, is very useful. And then we have the caring stories. If you want to save energy, people have to care about saving energy. They also have to care for the building and so on. So we have this whole system of stories, as we called it. And what we can conclude from that, our dominant economic narrative is generally relies on a hero story with technology as the hero solving our future problems. Sometimes even markets or capitalism can be seen as the hero. And what we're saying is hero stories are not enough. We need these caring, learning stories, perhaps even the horror stories as cautionary tales. Now, whether we believe in toppling the modern economic growth narrative or whether we just believe in complementing it, our point is that we need multiple stories to address our current challenges. So we're offering this metaphor of an ecosystem of stories which we think might be useful. And these multiplicity of stories could be seen as an ecosystem, and that stories coexist, they compete, perhaps even they consume each other. Perhaps a dominant narrative is an apex predator, who knows? And we know that ecosystems change over time in response to perturbations and shocks. And so stories might evolve to stay relevant. And we gave the example of the green growth narrative sort of evolving in response to the climate change, which change our story ecosystem. So thinking about that, our modern economic growth paradigm, it really relies heavily on orthodox economics or neoliberal economics, you call it as well. And there are many critiques of this. For example, John King says economics is unique among the social sciences in having a single monolithic mainstream, which is either unaware or actively hostile to alternative approaches. So this is an active pursuit of a single story, of reproducing the same dominant narrative. And we could say, well, is this an apex predator actively preying on other stories? Or another use of the ecosystem metaphor would be to think of this as what's called the green desert, that agricultural monoculture, which has grown to maximize yield and profit, as we know, but it is not resilient in the face of shocks, which could be a problem for us in our current challenges. So one more chapter in thinking about our ecosystem is the reaction to shock. So external shocks, in policy language, they generate windows of opportunity for policy development, or you could say for new narratives. For example, this has been studied in the context of the economic crisis that happened over 10 years ago. And we're thinking, what about COVID-19? This has also been a game changer. It's caused huge disruptions to our daily lives and also to policy. Huge changes were undertaken to fight the pandemic. Our lives rearranged. We had a new sense of normal. So we're trying to think, well, what opportunities might there be here? So the first thing is that early in the pandemic, we had what we might call glimpses of a different world. We know there were other ways of life. We had quiet roads, we had clean air. People started thinking about things differently. Our lives slowed down. What we're seeing now, you could say, is a struggle between let's go back to the way things were, to life as normal, or let's have social change. Let's think more about this well-being and see how we can change the system. And these actually mirror the main reactions to climate change. And again, COVID challenged the economic status quo, highlighting these inequalities, showing how our system has fragile efficiency rather than resilience. You can consider now the question of vaccines. We have the technical capability to make vaccines faster, but there are issues around economics and patents and so on and so forth. And again, heterodox economics uses the COVID to critique this mainstream narrative. So this is from Alves and Van Graven. In the coming months and years, there will be a battle to define the narrative of the pandemic. I'd say that battle has already started, actually. So fundamental change in the prevailing economic narrative is necessary from a just, robust, and democratic society. So this is thinking about COVID in terms of stories and ecosystems. So really a final chapter. This is really just gathering some of the thoughts which we're working on now. Really, we're saying that a variety of narratives can broaden the basis for policies to cope with our big challenges: climate change, environmental crises, and recovery from the pandemic. And we suggest there are interdisciplinary opportunities from here, from understanding, from partnering with energy systems. So the metaphors from the natural world are useful, talking about social and economic systems and what they have to do with each other, what they can learn from each other. We could also talk about arts and humanities and considering storytelling as a fresh perspective. And we know that this ties into questions of communication. Just want to, I'll just put up my last slide, which is an epilogue, just to say where we're coming from. So a bit of our forthcoming work on this, a book chapter and a paper, and some of the previous work, which Katy was one of the editors of a special issue a few years ago about narratives of storytelling, something we built on. And I'm not sure if we do have a couple minutes. Maybe Katy wants to add anything.
Yes.
Good morning to the US.
Good morning. I want to thank Noam for. I've been responding to some of the questions in the chat, and I guess I just wanted to say that in terms of the initial thinking of the system of stories, the work that I did with Marina Tapuzzi, that was originated. The horror story is a part of the system. But if you only focus on the hero story, the difficulty is that if the hero doesn't succeed, I mean, if you think about, what happens in the Avengers, right? If the heroes don't succeed, the world collapses. And I'm saying that if the hero doesn't succeed, actually what you get is a learning story. It's not so bad, but it's the way in which we construct the narrative that makes certain options viable and not. And I also wanted to say, I'm in Minnesota, I'm in Minneapolis, and I don't know if you guys were following the George Floyd story, but I think the example there of trying to understand systemic racism is an example of challenging the dominant narrative. So I think it's a very realistic way of thinking about why isn't it an issue that 3 people are killed by police every day. You'd think that would matter, but somehow it doesn't. That's the kind of impact that we think narratives have that teach you to think that some issues, even though there's objective evidence that it's happening, somehow the dominant systems don't necessarily seem to care. So that's the kind, we think that narratives absolutely matter, but that doesn't mean they also might not need to change, and they may need to change not by expanding, not just by toppling. So we're trying to use a different metaphor to get other stories into the mix. I have other examples, but I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Kate. I don't know if there's a question you would like to ask from to reply from our chat. We still have 1-2 minutes. You replied to mine already, and I think also during this intervention we consider that you replied to the others as well.
But... There you go. I mean, I think it's an interesting question about, sorry, the text is very small. One of the questions I thought was interesting, but, have we considered how these hero stories relate to ideas of technological determinism versus social construction of technology? So that's, an STS way of thinking about how technologies are developed. I don't think stories are technical. I think they may be associated with technologies, but I do think that the stories are human, again, made with available evidence. And that's one of the things that I found relative in the special issue of Energy Research and Social Science that Mithra Mosey and C. Rotman, who's at this conference, and I learned. It was a giant issue, and it was really, really interesting to see how different people thought about stories. But it is a fundamental way in which we see the world, including policymakers. We say evidence-based policy. It still is ideas wrapped into some kind, we're making meaning. That's what telling a story is. There's different flavors of stories, as Noam introduced at the outset. But it is basic, and we'll never be done with it. It's a human trait. So I think we should admit that that's true, rather than thinking that objective reality is that's also a story. I mean, there's no such thing really as.
Certainly true. And
Yeah,
thanks a lot for your intervention. Thank both of you for being available today. We need to go to our next presentation, but feel free to chat and answer the questions that are in the chat. And as I said, if you want to share the contact details or your social media profiles there, the chat is open. Our next presentation comes from Ellen Webborn. Ellen is working as a research associate in data science and end-use energy demand at UCL. And today she will present the research on the impacts of COVID lockdown on energy consumption in Great Britain. So Ellen, the floor is yours.
Hi there, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. So interestingly, the previous talk was all about storytelling, and I do have a story to tell today. So my official talk title is about the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns on energy consumption in GB. And a week ago, I was all set to give this talk. We had some great results. But what I'm actually going to talk to you about is why quantifying impact on energy consumption is actually really hard. And I have a cautionary tale to tell you, because as so often happens in research, one thing can happen which changes your whole ideas about your research and your results. So I think that's a more interesting story, but I hope you find it interesting too. So just a little bit of background about my research group. I'm part of the Smart Energy Research Lab at UCL. We're a consortium of 8 partners. You can see their logos there. And the aim is to provide an energy data resource for the UK research community, because at the moment it's really difficult to have access to high quality smart meter and link contextual data for innovative research. So this is a resource we're putting forward. And we have recruited and been collecting this data for around 13,000 households across Great Britain, representative of households with second generation smart meters. And we encourage people to apply to use this data in a secure lab environment. Briefly about the data we're collecting. So we're collecting electricity data daily and half hourly from all of our participants, theoretically, and we have their export data if it's available. And we can get historical data as well. We have a very similar setup for gas data, but we've only got about 70% of our participants with a gas meter we can access. We're linking that with weather data, so reanalysis data that's publicly available. It's available at an hourly resolution, 30 kilometers. We initially just had surface temperature, but we've been adding a lot more variables since we started. When participants sign up to take part in CEL, we send them a survey, and we have about 40 questions about the dwelling, the occupants, and attitudes and behaviours, things we think will be useful in understanding their energy consumption. And almost all of our participants have given us some data, and most have given us a really good amount of data from the survey. Finally, we're linking that with energy performance certificate if it's available, and about half of our participants have an energy performance certificate. So we're linking all of these data sets together at the household level, and obviously there's a lot of different research we want to do and a lot of other people are applying to do as well. So one of those projects is about COVID-19, and our aim is to really understand how energy consumption changed, in particular during lockdown 1 in Great Britain. So that was towards the end of March until the 11th of May, 7-week period when pretty much everything was shut. It was a national lockdown. We started by sending all of our participants recruited in the first wave a survey about their circumstances during lockdown, the number of occupants, children at home, things like that. And our very initial research, it doesn't actually use this survey data. We're just going to be mainly focusing on the smart meter data, trying to calculate the change in mean daily energy consumption for our participants. So using daily electricity and gas readings for participants who had both electricity and gas, so the idea is they would have gas heating. And we compare their energy consumption in lockdown with what we're calling a comparable 7-week period. So to define our 7-week comparable period, we calculated the number of degree days during 7-week periods in 2019. We also looked at the mean temperature across all locations where our participants were located for each 7-week period in 2019 and the 7-week lockdown period in 2020. And we were able to identify a 7-week period starting about late September 2019 with similar average temperatures to lockdown. So this was our comparable period. We would compare the energy use in each. So my initial findings are really exciting. We found that electricity consumption increased by about 10%, gas consumption increased by 40%, and we saw much bigger increases during weekdays compared to the weekends, which is exactly what you'd expect when more people are staying home. However, I'm going to put my hands up and say I did use the wrong comparison period. I've been looking at an old document. So I actually was using the 8th of September, not the 27th, for my start of my 7-week comparable period. And when I used the correct comparison period, it gave me completely different results. So I found that electricity consumption went up by about 2% and it went down on weekends, which might be reasonable. But I found that gas consumption decreased by 20% on average. So we would be saying that people stayed home more, so they used less gas, which makes no sense whatsoever. So what's going on? Clearly, the results are really sensitive to this comparable period chosen. And obviously, average temperature is not the only factor. Solar radiation was something we thought might play a role, but how much of a role we weren't sure. And intuitively, it felt like maybe the end of September to mid-November didn't really seem comparable to kind of late March to into May. So instead of trying to present the results or picking a different period, we decided to investigate the sensitivity. So I took about 1,300 households that didn't have any missing data during the periods we were going to consider for electricity and gas. And just to give you an idea, lockdown energy consumption was about 9 kilowatt hours per day, and for gas it was about almost 32 kilowatt hours on average per day across this group. So let's start by looking at what the weather was like in lockdown. So on the blue points here, we've got the left axis, so that's external temperature in degrees. And on the y-axis on the right, you've got solar radiation in yellow. And the point location, so here you've got, say, the 1st of September. This point refers to the average across the 7 weeks starting from the 1st of September. So this point up here is the solar radiation during lockdown on average for the 7-week period starting mid-March. And this blue one you see here is the external temperature during lockdown. So immediately you can see that it was much more sunny during lockdown than it was in this period here. And it was kind of a lot warmer than the 7 weeks preceding lockdown. But there is a point that could match it. So the next thing we looked at was what happens if you use the same 7 weeks in the previous year. So I've put these triangles for the same period in the previous year. And we can see that it was a lot sunnier compared to the same time in the year before. So if you're not in Britain, you might be surprised that it can get that sunny, but actually lockdown last year was really sunny, which is a problem for our analysis because clearly it's playing some kind of role. And it was also a bit warmer. So if we try and find a comparable period for these, we get to the end of September for the temperature, but there's nothing really comparable for the solar radiation. And we didn't want to go back too far because we lose data as we go back in time because we have fewer participants with how much data. But it was kind of the idea that autumn and spring would be sort of similar. But clearly there's some differences. So what happens if you take these different periods and see what the impact, what the difference between energy consumption would be? So this plot shows you the change in mean daily lockdown from the period to, the change in mean daily consumption from the period indicated by the point to lockdown. So these ones over here above the x-axis, the black line here, they show positive. So it means that there was more energy consumed during lockdown, whereas these ones are negative. There was less energy consumed during lockdown. So in winter, people were consuming a lot more than during the lockdown. So my first analysis is over here. So that gave us the results we expected, that people were using more when they were staying at home more. But just by moving this period not that much, you get quite a big change. So it's actually really sensitive to where you start. And interestingly, electricity also has a difference. So you'd expect heating to be quite different, but you might not expect electricity to be that different from the times of year. So you can basically pick the period you want to get the results you're looking for if you were inclined to do that. But it shows how difficult it is to try and see the impact of something when you haven't got a control group at the same time, and when the weather conditions are so different. So our next steps are to continue working on a model that we've been working on to try and predict energy consumption based on lots of other factors. So things like the number of occupants, things like the dwelling, energy performance certificate. And we're going to compare the lockdown consumption with what we predict it to be based on our other data, based on the model. We're going to analyze the half-hourly data because we're interested in how time of use changed. Did the peak shift? Now people's days look quite different without going to work, without children going to school. And we'll do some cluster analysis to see how different groups experience the lockdown differently. So did they have children at home? Were they in financial difficulty, remote working, retired residents in outdoor space? We've got lots of information from the survey that we're going to start using. But I'd be really interested to hear if people have got ideas or found similar things when trying to understand the impact of things on energy consumption when something has changed. I'd like to thank my colleagues who work on this project, and particularly Francis Hollick, who provided the climate and the weather data for me, and other colleagues who have also been really helpful for discussions. And I'll leave you with some information about the Smart Energy Research Lab, which if you're based at a UK university or partnered with one, you can apply to use our data. So we encourage you to look into that. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Helen. That was a really nice story and a nice way of changing your initial, let's say, idea and coming up with this presentation. From my side, yeah, I have like a kind of question. We all remember the sunny days of last year's first lockdown. It was kind of good times compared to this year. So I guess, are you planning also in the future to test this period, the 2021 period, to perform a similar comparison/analysis? And also, if you have any insights, early insights from your cluster analysis related to different patterns of user groups.
We haven't done any cluster analysis yet. This research is very much at the early stage because we've really spent the last couple of years setting up this whole infrastructure and collecting the data and recruiting participants. We'll definitely be studying periods after the first lockdown last year, but it's quite a difficult challenge because we've had lots of different lockdowns. Lots of different areas of the country have had different types of lockdown. So there's no kind of back to normal that we could compare with yet for this period, apart from 2019. So yeah, it's a tricky one to try and work out what your baseline would be. There is no kind of normal at the moment, and I don't think there really has been for at least a year. So yeah.
I bet that can be very tricky, but still, I mean, it's a really nice project, having all these households on board. We have questions in the chat. I don't know if you can read.
Sure. Did you separate households who had solar PV installations from those who didn't? So I'll start with that one first. We didn't. This was just our first pass at the data, but we don't have a lot of people with PV installations, so it wouldn't have made a big difference to the results. But we'll definitely separate out people who had solar PV, who had electric vehicles, different types of heating and things like that. 30-minute periods, that's because smart meters in Britain record half-hourly data. So they record daily, but they also record half-hourly. So we're very much driven by the data available.
Very nice. If we don't have any other questions, thanks a lot, Helen, for your work and presentation, and we can move on to the next one. It's with us, Wendell Grinton. He's a PhD student in civil engineering at the Virginia Tech, and today he will speak to us on optimizing energy feedback messages using functional near-infrared spectroscopy. So, looking forward to hear from you, Wendell.
Hello, everybody. My name is Wendell Grinton. I'm a PhD student in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Virginia Tech, and I'll be talking a little bit about energy feedback messaging and using a brain imaging instrument to kind of optimize these messages. And also, if you have any questions or anything, my advisor, Dr. Freddie Page, would be happy to answer them in the chat while I'm presenting. So aside from the cost of energy bills, consumers don't really understand, what their energy bill is communicating to them, which has caused for a lack of engagement or a lack of interaction with said bills. So in the diagram you see here, it's just the number of minutes that are within an entire year, which is 5.256K. And so consumers normally interact with their energy bills for about 8 minutes per month, which is, or 8 minutes per year, which is about 40 seconds per month. And so here we really wanted to highlight that consumers don't really engage with their energy bills. And so to kind of address this lack of interaction, we're looking at using energy feedback messages, which are socio-technical innovations that can help consumers engage more with their energy bills. It can also help them to, learn a little bit more about their energy feedback, and these devices and innovations can help the consumer to save anywhere between 5 to 20% on their monthly energy bills as well. And so energy feedback messages, as you can see, come in many types of formats. So for example, you can get them anywhere from your Apple Watch to a mobile notification to a emailed e-bill or online user interface. And so with these messages, we looked at e-bills or reports, and then we also looked at text-based alerts. And so to improve these messages, we kind of leaned on existing message design theories to kind of further personalize and improve the aesthetic of current energy feedback messages. So first, you have choice architecture. So we looked at choice architecture to not only personalize, but to better frame how these messages are presented to consumers to improve the engagement and the interaction with these messages. Next, we looked at color. So color can highlight the most bold or the most important information embedded within a body of text, so that it's easier for the consumer to identify said information. Next, we looked at text size and different fonts. So we used Microsoft Sans Serif, as we found in prior literature that was one of the fonts that were most appealing or easiest for consumers to read and to understand. And lastly, we use action items. So action items are simply just direct recommendations that provide the consumer with actionable items or tips to improve how they're using energy in their daily lives. And additionally, to kind of test the efficacy of the impact of these existing message design theories on energy feedback messages, we used an fNIRS device, which stands for Functional Near Infrared Spectroscopy. This device, through a sensor-covered cap, it measures your brain function through changes in blood flow patterns. And so here we really wanted to highlight that we can't necessarily qualify how participants are their thinking process, but we can quantify through the prefrontal cortex how their brain is activating while they're looking at energy feedback messages. So COVID also had a restriction on our study, so we weren't able to test as many people as we wanted to because the lab just opened back up. So we've just kind of started back with the process. And so some of our preliminary findings for these messages is what I'm going to be talking about mainly. So here we came up with 3 different categories of messages. To the far left is monetary gains. In the middle is monetary losses. and to the far right is goal setting. And so we found that these three types of message themes were most appealing or most impactful for consumers. And so uh, basically, with all these messages, the only thing that we changed was the fourth line down. And so that's the actionable recommendation that I had mentioned previously. And based on a network analysis that we conducted with the fNIRS data, we found that the curb monetary gains messages produced the most cognitive response. So with that, that just means that these types of messages are causing the participant to think the most about how that specific message is framed. Further, we did the same thing with e-gauge messages, and so but these were text-based messages, so it just provided the consumer with, or the participant, excuse me, with the actionable recommendation solely in a text message to kind of see, what the effectiveness of that was. And what we found was monetary losses were found to have the most cognitive response. Now, I also want to note that we didn't compare the curve messages to the e-gauge messages simply because we haven't really gotten to the nitty gritty into our study yet. But for future studies, we will compare the two to kind of see any synergies or any differences. After we conducted experiments, we gave the participants a post-task survey on the messages and just kind of see, if they had any further analysis or anything else that we could use to kind of better explain what we found. And so some of the most memorable messages that participants exclaimed were the ones that contain like the actionable recommendations or that gave them insight on how they could earn money or decrease their utility bill. Also, some of the easier messages they understood was, again, the actionable suggestions or recommendations, or providing them with direct information on what they should act on or how they can act to improve their energy bill. And some of the harder messages that they exclaimed were the ones that contained kilowatt hours, because they weren't necessarily familiar with what kilowatt hours were or how that impacted their energy bill. And so we found that participants really kind of cling to what they know. So if they're familiar with the information, if they're familiar with how the information is presented, then they are more likely to engage with it and interact with it. But if they don't necessarily understand what the information is conveying to them, then they kind of just look at it and just keep on going. And finally, we found that, like I had mentioned earlier, because of the lack of interaction, current energy bills just aren't really engaging. And we've also found that within our preliminary data, as participants explained that they had only interacted with their energy bills prior to this study for 5 minutes or less. So future work can explore, or will explore, testing larger and more diverse sample populations, testing participants periodically, so for about every 3 months, to determine if there's a response relapse to the energy feedback messages. We can also integrate energy feedback messages and how they communicate energy information to consumers in future policies. And lastly, we can collaborate with energy monitoring companies to implement these devices into communities to test their effectiveness and to help consumers to be more energy efficient. So I'd like to thank my committee, as well as all of the organizations that I'm a part of that you see here. And lastly, please remember that universally designed energy feedback messages can be achieved by personalizing messages to target consumers and what they care about the most. And there's my contact information. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Wendell. It was a very nice presentation, and we have some questions in the chat. Actually, my question was also similar. If you can say a bit more on the different messages you tested, in addition to voluntary issues. So feel free to take the questions from the chat and reply.
All right, let's see.
Hey, Wendell, to make it easier, I can read the questions to you because I already answered some of them, the ones I haven't answered. So Devin asked if the cognitive activity correlates with memorable or hard to read, hard or / easy messages in the post-task survey.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it again?
Yeah, so did the cognitive activity correlate to the memorable or hard / easy messages in the post-task survey? So have you run a correlation between your cognitive activity and the survey data?
Yeah, so we found some interesting information there. So typically the messages that people remember the most were some of the ones that came closer to the end because they were, fresher on their brain rather than, the messages that they were shown at the beginning because, over time, as you see a lot of information, the stuff that you see at the beginning starts to become a little cloudy. And so we noticed that in this preliminary data.
So to kind of help with that, we do randomize how people are shown the messages. So as we get more data points, we can see, is it just what they see last, or are there anything sticking out throughout the study? Because the way we randomize the blocks. But we're not actually trying to strive for understanding, is there a correlation between the survey data and the fNIRS data too much. It's more because we have this opportunity, we want to just explore it and collect it on the end and to help really expand what we're finding with the fNIRS device. And I think the qualitative questions are really going to be what expands how people are experiencing these messages. But that's going to be a tricky task to line that up with the quantitative fNIRS data. Do we have more time for another question?
Yes, for sure, 1 2 minutes.
All right. Okay. So I will pick, let's see, I'll just pick randomly. Laura, can you say a bit more about the different messages you tested in addition to monetary? For example, did you test messages around you can make your home warmer by or more comfortable?
I don't think so. We pretty much surrounded our messages around. So for the monetary gains and losses, we surrounded them solely around. We framed them solely around if they will save money or if they will lose money. So, for example, one message was you're using too much energy. Consider using like outdoor sunlight to dry your clothes or something like that. Like a message that was framed, messages that were framed pretty much around monetary gains or losses, not necessarily around making the consumer more comfortable or not.
I would like to thank you both for this. It was a really nice collaboration. Thank you, Wendell. You of course have take your time to also reply individually in the chat if you wish and connect with other participants. And we move to our next presentation from Spyridon Karytsas. Spyros is an assistant professor at the Department of Economics and Sustainable Development of the Charkoupia University of Athens, and he will talk to us today on factors affecting public awareness and acceptance of CO2 capture, transport and storage on a transnational comparison. So, Spyros, you are here with us.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Thank you. Just to make a correction, okay, I'm also connected to the Harokopio University, but this presentation has to do with my other position in the Center for Renewable Energy Sources and Saving, CRES. It is a research center in Greece, and I will be presenting the Mo4Air project, which is a European funded project. And my title is The Factors Affecting Public Awareness and Acceptance of CO2 Capture, Transport, and Storage. So, some general information on the Mo4Air project. I should note that it is mainly a technically focused project. It has to do with the development of technologies related to the capturing of CO2 using metal organic frameworks. As I said, it is a European funded project through the Horizon 2020 framework. And it includes 14 partners from 8 countries. Its duration is 48 months. It started around 2 years ago, and it has at least 2 years more of running. Perhaps it will be extended due to the pandemic conditions. As I said, 14 partners. You can see that there are partners from Greece, Turkey, Italy, France, Belgium, United Kingdom, Norway, and South Korea. The demonstration sites involved in the project are located in Turkey, France, and Norway. And although it is quite, as I said before, a quite technical project, one of its objectives is to increase stakeholder and public awareness regarding the challenges, benefits, and issues related to CCS infrastructure. Now, the project consists of 11 work packages, and the work that has to do with the social acceptance and the other social issues is included in work package 8, which has to do with the transferability, replicability, and social issues, which is led by our organization, CRES. Specifically, task 8.1 has to do with the study of social issues related to CCS, and our methodology to work on these issues is to organize and perform both a quantitative and a qualitative study. The quantitative study will be based on a questionnaire survey focused in all participating countries, while the qualitative study will be based on semi-structured interviews on specific stakeholders. On the other hand, I should mention that the questionnaire survey will be focused on local residents among the participating countries. Based on the results of the two studies, we are going to develop an engagement strategy, and based on that, we will proceed with the development of specific public engagement scenarios focused on the specialities and the characteristics of each location. Right now, we have, until now, we have worked on the initial parts of the whole process. We have conducted a literature review in order to identify what has been done until now in the specific area, to identify potential research gaps, And what we have done is used two groups of key phrases or keywords. The one has to do with CCS or carbon capture and utilization and storage. And on the other hand, we have a group of keywords concerning public acceptance, public engagement, social acceptance, perceptions, attitude, etc. Based on the combination of these two groups of keywords, we identified around 350 relevant articles and other material. And after a first screening, we concluded with around 50 articles and other material. These 50 articles have been assessed in detail in order to collect information to construct our questionnaire survey, to develop our unstructured interview protocol, and in order to perform a stakeholder mapping. Based on the findings from the 50 articles and the other material, we have developed a conceptual model which illustrates the relations between the determinants of general and local acceptance of CCS infrastructure. As we can see, the main determinants of general acceptance and local acceptance, or let's say the determinants that have been explored most in previous research are risk and benefit perceptions, as well as trust in the relevant organizations and stakeholders. Other determinants of acceptance are knowledge of relevant issues, prior experience with these technologies, climate change concerns, general attitude towards technology, place attachment, as well as fairness and engagement activities. Through this mapping, we have illustrated all the interconnections between these factors, and we have used it as the base in order to develop our questionnaire, to develop our hypothesis to be examined, and in order to identify the research gaps from previous research. Now, we have drafted the questionnaire, which includes most of the factors presented in the previous illustration. We have decided to provide information to the general public, as we have seen that the general public's level of information concerning CCS technologies is rather low. And after providing this information, to ask all specific questions. We have identified and structured a specific information text in order to be as neutral as possible, in order not to make them decide positively or negatively towards CCS. Based on the identified research gaps of previous research, we could say that the innovative aspects of the research that we are conducting is, first of all, the transnational comparison, as it is going to be performed in all participating countries of the project. We are going to perform a comparison, not in general on CCS facilities, but we are going to perform different. We are going to perform comparisons on the different phases of CCS, meaning a different comparison concerning capture, transfer, and storage facilities. We are going to examine the differences concerning the determinants of general and local acceptance. We are going to emphasize on the determinants that have not been thoroughly examined in the past concerning CCS, meaning mainly engagement activities and fairness. And based on all this, we are going to create a model that is going to combine all the above issues. So that's it for me. That is our main activity until now within the Mo4R European project. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Spyros. From my side, I have just one question related to what is the expected size of your sample, and also when you expect the first results of your survey.
Okay, as we are talking about 7 different countries, I'm talking about the European countries because we are also having some Korean partners in the consortium, but it is not sure that they are going to be able to participate. We will try to have around 400 participants from each country. Of course, we will have to see if budget-wise this is applicable, and we also have to take into account that based on the specific conditions, meaning the pandemic, we will have to see how the survey is going to be conducted. Possibly, it is going to be conducted through an online tool because it will also help us provide the information that I mentioned, the information text, and perhaps a small diagram, a graph presenting the whole infrastructure in order to make to inform people. So our target is 400 people per country, meaning around 3,000 people in total. But we will see if this is possible based on financial and technical barriers. Now, as the questionnaire is almost finalized, we have to do the more administrative and managerial work concerning the distribution of the questionnaire, etc. So I believe that within the summer, let's say early autumn, we will have our results and we will be able to work on them and have our first quantitative results. Thank you.
Many thanks, Spyros. Good luck with the continuation of the project.
Thank you very much.
We will keep monitoring it. Last but not least, Emilie Vrain is a senior research associate in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. I misspelled that. Emilie will talk to us about social influence and the adoption of low carbon digital innovation. Emilie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much. Just trying to get my video working as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to be presenting some work which I've conducted with some colleagues at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, and it's part of a project that's called Silky. Now, the backdrop to my presentation is a statement of the obvious, which is life is becoming increasingly digital. So with this digitalization, there are innovations which can potentially help reduce emissions. And I'm going to outline 5 ways in which they can do so. So the first, they can enable a shift from owning goods to accessing services. So using real-time information about supply matched with demand. So here, these blue mobility app icons represent some examples. So rather than owning a car, it's possible to access the service of traveling by car through car clubs or ride sharing or shared ride hailing. Another way is they provide the ability to increase the use of physical goods and reduce waste. So for example, the peer-to-peer platforms for sharing or trading, but also 11th hour food apps, which help connect consumers to food outlets with surplus food. Here, the yellow app icons represent the innovations in the energy domain, and the green icon is the food domain. Another way is something we're all doing right now, in that it allows to substitute for physical movement, so teleworking and video conferencing. But they can also help if there's e-commerce, which are efficiently run, as this substitutes for lots of little car journeys when we're all going shopping. A fourth way is they can provide users with greater control over devices, so like heating and lighting through smart technology, which are shown here in the red icons, which represent the home domain. Now, this control can help manage energy demand and goes hand in hand with the electrification of end-use products. And the final way is the distribution of energy resources and loads requires this really complex real-time coordination of balancing and flexibility. And so digitalization helps support these systems functioning and performance. So all these innovations I've just shown you potentially help us to reduce our energy demand. But such benefits will only be realized if they're adopted at scale. And so how can we get them to the mass market? Now, we've known about innovation diffusion for decades. Thus, Everett Rogers, in his book, The Diffusion of Innovation, frames the diffusion process as being fundamentally social and interpersonal. So emphasizing the important role that those early adopters help in spreading information through those social networks. Now, it's this framework that we use in our research to help investigate such topic. And so we've been conducting multiple studies on and around these 4 key elements you can see on the screen. But today I'm going to focus on the work that we've done on social influences, in which we focus on 4 distinct but related mechanisms of spreading information from person to person. So there's word of mouth, otherwise known as WOM. There's also electronic word of mouth, EWOM, which relates to online communication. The third and fourth mechanisms are slightly more diffuse, and so social norms are awareness of what others think is normal and common, but also acceptable and approved. And then there's neighborhood effects as the fourth, whereby we observe activity around us and it indirectly impacts our own thinking. So with these 4 in mind, our aim was to understand what generalizable insights exist with regards to the social influence processes across a range of different innovations, but whilst also recognizing there are important differences in the context and adoption environments, and so potentially shaping the differences of these mechanisms at play. So what we did was we investigated 16 innovations across these 4 consumption domains, and we surveyed 3,000 people in the UK during 2019. Our survey design was to be able to identify 100 adopters of each innovation and 100 non-adopters who had at least heard of the innovation and had some knowledge of it. And so just to give you some of our results, the first thing we did, we looked at just the non-adopters and we split them into 2 groups. So those who stated that they had a high propensity to adopt an innovation and those who had a low propensity. We asked questions about the relative importance of those 4 different social influence mechanisms. And we found that all of them were to be significantly more important for the high adoption propensity non-adopters. Now, I must point out this is cross-sectional survey data, so we can't infer causality, but these results are consistent with the interpretation that information from our interpersonal sources help reduce non-adopter perceived risks and uncertainties, and therefore help make them more likely to adopt. Of the 4 social influences, we found that word of mouth had the largest effects across all innovations. So these are the general results if we look across all of the ones that we were investigating, all the innovations. But we were also keen to see if different social influences are actually stronger for specific types of innovation. So what we did next, we clustered the innovations into 3 different distinct groups based on their attributes. So the first group were those that were very trialable, and there's a couple of examples here. There were those which were highly observable in cluster 2. And cluster 3 are distinct in that they're very complex and non-trialable, so they really required an upfront purchase cost. So here are the examples of smart home technology. We developed models for each of these clusters, and we statistically tested which social influence is most important. Now, our results revealed that, as before, word of mouth was significant across all 3 clusters, but that if we focus on cluster 2's model, word of mouth and social norms were also significant. So this implies that highly observable innovations therefore benefit from much more social influence mechanisms, increasing the likelihood of high propensity. Now, another important element to consider beyond just the attributes is the context in which they're actually used. So we conducted additional data collection to explore this. We chose 3 innovations as deep dive case studies, which represented the different domains, but were also used in different contexts. So the first here being peer-to-peer ride sharing, which occurs in the context of a very trusting environment between users. The second, smart home technologies, which are used in privacy and have low salience. And then the third being digital food hubs, which occur within a community context. Now, we collected a huge range of quantitative and qualitative data from hundreds of adopters and non-adopters of each of these 3 innovations, and to gather much more detailed information on social influences. And I only have a few more minutes left, so I won't have enough time to go into too many results, but just to give you a few examples of what we found that an effective mechanism for increasing the use of ride sharing was within the workplace, with companies introducing shared commuting schemes. This development of a social norm as a kind of workplace culture helped encourage more and more employees to adopt it. With smart home technology, we found that the different types of word of mouth were most effective at helping to diffuse information from adopters to non-adopters. This helped increase the salience of them. But we did find that the biggest barrier was that many non-adopters just lacked exposure and didn't even know anyone who had smart technology to get this first-hand knowledge and information from. With the digital food hubs, word of mouth within the local area was reported as being the best source of information and the most important for persuading adoption and shaping opinions. But here again, we also found that such word of mouth often occurred in echo chambers, whereby adopters were just preaching to the converted, and so wider adoption just wasn't occurring. And so to conclude, digitalization offers an opportunity for both end use and system energy efficiency. Public policy has a critical role to play in steering these digital consumer innovations towards helping to deliver emission reduction benefits. Through focusing on a wide range of innovations, we find that social influences are important determinants of adoption propensity across different contexts and user groups, and this provides a robust result with wide generalizability. We found that electronic word of mouth is the dominant mechanism for helping to exchange information. And so this really highlights the ever-increasing need for policy strategies aimed at improving digital skills as well as equitable access to digital infrastructure. We found some subtle differences in the importance of specific mechanisms. So, for example, the social norms being much more important for those which are highly visible. And through our case studies, we found that innovations requiring trust need strategies to help with social norms. Innovations with low salience can be benefited from strategies which increase the exposure from non-adopters from adopters. And strategies supporting partnerships and outreach for community-based innovations will really help reach much wider networks of potential adopters. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Many thanks, Emilie, for the great presentation. We have a question in the chat. It's quite big text, so you can read it. Until you do so, I have also a question of my own, which is very easy, I think. It relates to this word of mouth kind of being the strongest among the other ones or more impactful than the other one means of transferring information. And I know you said you don't investigate causality, but do you have any theories behind why?
So we've actually ended up doing, with the 3,000 participants that we had in 2019, we've ran a second wave. So we're currently actually looking at sort of changes in the adoption status, so whether people have actually rejected the innovation since 2019, or we've got new adopters. And so we're sort of seeing the differences between has social influence changed in that time period. And so we're hoping to be able to start pulling out those sort of causality factors. Unfortunately, our second wave data was conducted with COVID impact. So we were able to add in some nice COVID impact questions to the survey. And so it's kind of this sort of big external factor that might really influence, but let's say for the car sharing, I think none of us are actually probably allowed to be car sharing right now in our lockdown. So
in theory.
Yeah, but so if we're focusing on the wave one data, with e-word of mouth, I mean, the fact that they're all digital innovations themselves, so a lot of them are smartphone apps, you kind of need digital skills, and you're going to be, if you're a user, you're an adopter, you're going to be quite digitally tuned. So you might be more on social media. We did also ask a lot of sort of how often are you on social networks online? How much do you use? Do you buy your shopping online? All these other sort of factors. I have just shown just the social influence type results. So, but I would say with the e-word of mouth, it's probably very connected with the fact that they're actually digital innovations themselves. Yeah.
Very nice. Katy asks something. I don't know, you can read.
Yeah, so she's asking.
I can summarize.
Thanks, Katy.
Basically, I mean, I'm interested. I've also done studies of technology adoption, but also of rejection. And I think my point is really in the text is I'm thinking about rejection is not just the absence of adoption. I think it's a deliberate choice. And as we were just talking about, digital innovations that reduce carbon, I'm thinking about a very analog lifestyle, which also is very low carbon. And doesn't need to be changed by digital technology. Mm-hmm. And so it's the question of the framing of the research, I think, along the diffusion of innovations framework, which really looks at adoption. It doesn't look at rejection. It doesn't look at other pathways. And so I guess I'm wondering, my rhetorical question was, what would a study of rejection of digital life look like? Because it's kind of a rhetorical question. Forgive me. It was just where my mind was going.
No, I love that you're bringing rejection up, because as I mentioned before, this wave 2 data, what we were hoping to find was that we would have a lot more adopters. That this information had been spreading in the past year and a half. We'd have a lot more adopters, and we'd be able to see what was it that encouraged them. But what we found was we had a lot of rejectors, and I know the rejectors that you're referring to are those that have actively chosen not to even adopt in the first place. But we found a lot of what the literature refers to as discontinuous. So they chose to adopt in the first place, but then they realized, nah, it's not actually that great. I'm going to stop using it. And so we're currently sort of doing a lot of focus on the rejectors. So people who are non-adopters and are still non-adopters, but they've actually decreased their opinion about them. They think they're a lot negative about them. And we're looking at kind of what factors are influencing this. And you're right, like the Rogers framework really is very adoption biased. And there's a lot of focus on every innovation should go forward and should be successful and adopted like everywhere. So we're really, I agree with you. And we're sort of working on focusing on this rejection in our next work.
It's also in the vein of the work that Noam and I are doing about multiple stories. Is it possible to have a segment of society that is digitally enabled and shops online, and still have people who make their own syrup at home instead of going to buy it in a store? I mean, I think there should be multiple pathways, and I worry sometimes that we're trying to fit everyone into the same box when what we're seeing really in the world, if we accept inclusion and diversity, that doesn't mean that everybody has to be the same.
No, exactly. And
so-
I feel like with, especially what this pandemic is doing, it's pushed a lot of us towards having to become more digital and having to resort to Zoom for conferences. And so it's really kind of there's a huge talk about the digital divide that's being increased. And so, yeah, I agree. There's a lot of kind of funneling in terms of this. The future is going to become digital. There's no doubt about it. It already is. It's kind of embracing how do we make sure it's going to be a low carbon future with the help of this digitalization is kind of what we're really focusing on.
Yeah, and for people still to be able to walk, I think.
Well, with this kind of nice message connecting a Zoom conference with digitalization, I would like to thank all of you for making this session very lively, even if it was digital. I hope we will be able to meet at some point in a real live event. I forgot in the very beginning to introduce myself. So I'm Giorgos Koukoufikis. I was your moderator for the session. I work at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission on a unit working on knowledge management for the Energy Union, and my team works on the social aspects of the energy transition. Myself, I'm more specialized on social innovation. And with this, I want to invite you tomorrow on a session that we participate. This is section 6A at 3 p.m. And it's about energy communities and related behavioral strategies to energy efficiency. I welcome you to contact our team because we really like to have a lot of interactions with external stakeholders. Thanks again, all of you, for the very interesting presentation. Feel free to contact each other and continue collaborating on the topics. It was a really nice session, and I hope you will have lunch or breakfast or dinner, depending on which part of the world are you. Thank you very, very much.